Good evening, and welcome to Soft History to Sleep. Tonight, we'll be drifting back to a time when being born a woman meant one thing above all else: work. Endless, thankless, repetitive work. Whether you were a noble lady in velvet or a peasant in burlap, your days were long, your freedom was limited, and your hands were never still. So if you're lying there tonight wondering if you've done enough, let me assure you, compared to medieval women, you're practically on vacation. Now, before we begin this sleepy and slightly miserable stroll through the past, if you enjoy these gentle, strange, and ever so slightly exasperated bedtime stories, please take a moment to like this video and follow the channel. That way, whenever you need a quiet companion to help you fall asleep, you'll know exactly where to find us. Now then, close your eyes, let the day go, and let's travel back to a world of calloused hands, tight laces, and very little comfort. She might have been called Edith if she was a peasant, or Isolde if she belonged to nobility, but honestly, her name hardly mattered, because from the moment she entered the world, her path was already paved with expectation, repetition, and the sort of labor no one would ever write songs about. Being female in medieval Europe wasn't so much an identity as it was a job title, a lifelong role that began in girlhood and never truly ended. For peasant girls, childhood was a very short intermission before duty began. By the time she was 6 or 7, when children today are still learning to tie their shoes, she would already be contributing to the household. Not with gentle tasks, but with the essentials: hauling water in wooden buckets almost as big as her torso, sweeping dirt floors with bound twig brooms, collecting firewood that scratched her arms raw, or pulling feathers from freshly slaughtered chickens while her mother stirred gruel over a smoky fire. There were no toys, no colorful school books, no nap breaks with story time. If she was lucky, she might fashion a doll out of rags, but even play was often interrupted by the cry of a younger sibling or a sharp command to help with the spinning wheel. And then there was clothing, or more accurately, the making of it. You see, in a world with no H&M and not even a local thrift shop, every item of clothing was a commitment. First, the sheep had to be sheared, a seasonal task involving strong arms and steady hands. Then came the carding, where wool was combed clean of burrs and dirt. Then spinning, transforming fiber into thread with a rhythm that haunted your wrists for hours. Then weaving the cloth on a loom your grandfather built. And finally, the sewing, by firelight, with fingers already rough from scrubbing pots in river water so cold it could crack your knuckles. And if the shirt didn't fit? Too bad. You wore it anyway. As for education, well, unless you count learning how to knead bread, bandage wounds, or avoid being accused of witchcraft, most peasant girls grew up entirely illiterate. Reading and writing were luxuries of the male and the holy. Now, let's talk about the charming age of 12, that awkward moment when you began menstruating and your family started discussing who you should marry. Not if, mind you, who. Because once your body could carry a child, you were suddenly valuable in the local barter economy. And marriage wasn't about love or choice or compatibility, it was about survival. Your family needed fewer mouths to feed, and your husband's family needed another set of hands. And so, with a handshake and maybe 2 chickens thrown in as a dowry, you were spoken for. Still think your Monday is hard? Let me introduce you to theirs. Monday was laundry day, which involved dragging filthy tunics, undergarments, and linens to the riverbank, scrubbing them against stones with handfuls of ash or lye, then wringing them out with frozen fingers while your children wailed in the background and the chickens stole your bread. This was done year-round, regardless of frost, wind, or whether your hands had already cracked open from cold. And while you did all this, while you crouched there in the muck, surrounded by women who were equally exhausted and equally resigned, you didn't ask yourself what your passion was. You didn't consider your life's purpose or whether you were living your truth. You were just surviving. And the hardest part? No one thought it was strange. Because it had always been this way. And it would be, for a very long time. Now, if her days were filled with never-ending chores, her body was the unpaid intern in this whole operation, doing the hardest work, receiving the least gratitude, and, worst of all, having absolutely no say in what happened to it. From the moment a girl got her first period, usually somewhere between the ages of 12 and 14, the local consensus was, "Ah, splendid. She's ready to get married now." Not ready emotionally. Not ready legally. Just menstruating. And therefore, marriageable. You know, like a melon at the market. And once she was married, often to a man she barely knew and definitely didn't choose, her body quickly became a revolving door for pregnancies. There was no discussion of spacing children or family planning. The plan was, have as many babies as your uterus can withstand before it collapses or you do. And while you were pregnant, by the way, there were no breaks from your normal duties. You still hauled firewood, scrubbed pots with ashes, twisted rope, carded wool, and somehow found time to breastfeed one baby while growing another. Pregnant? Great. Now go stir the gruel. Giving birth was something women did in a dark corner, usually attended by another woman who had seen it done before, maybe once or twice, and probably had a few herbs in her apron and a prayer on her lips. If the baby cried, wonderful. If it didn't, you cried instead and then got back to folding laundry. Because yes, laundry still needed to be done. And menstruation? Well, let's just say modern period care is a miracle on par with electricity. Medieval women used cloth rags, which were, of course, washed and reused, or if you were less lucky, moss, sheep's wool, or absolutely nothing. Tampons? Pads? Painkillers? Try crouching behind a cottage with a stick between your teeth. Some used herbs to dull the pain. Some just worked through it. And don't even get me started on PMS. No one cared if you were irritable. Everyone was irritable. It was the Middle Ages. And through all this, she was told, over and over, that her body wasn't hers. It belonged to her husband, to her family, to the church. If she refused to lie with her husband, that was disobedience. If she spoke out about the pain, the bleeding, the fear, that was weakness. If she dared to question any of it, that was sin. Everything her body did, from menstruating to laboring to simply existing, was a potential offense. But she endured. Because endurance wasn't noble, it was mandatory. Because nobody was coming to rescue her. Because this was simply how life was, and nobody thought it strange. Except, of course, us, sitting here in the 21st century, warm, horizontal, and hopefully not washing our menstrual rags in a frozen stream. Now, you might be thinking, well, sure, the peasants had it rough. But noblewomen, they lived in castles. With silk dresses. Surely they had a better deal? To which I say, yes, absolutely, if your definition of a better deal includes being permanently supervised, strategically married off before your frontal cortex finished developing, and sewn into dresses so tight you couldn't sneeze without praying to Saint Margaret. Noble girls were raised like extremely expensive furniture, displayed, dusted, and handled with caution. They were educated, yes, but only in things that made them pleasant: embroidery, music, Latin prayers, and how not to show too much emotion in public. Expressing an opinion was seen as suspicious. Asking questions? Dangerous. And heaven forbid you got caught giggling with a stable boy, that could get you locked in a convent faster than you could say chastity belt. Marriage was a business transaction, no romance, no butterflies. You were a strategic alliance in a brocade gown. Your father needed land or power or the favor of a duke, and you, at the ripe age of 13 or 14, were the signed contract. Your future husband may have been old enough to be your grandfather, and often was. But you were expected to be grateful, obedient, and pregnant as soon as possible. And even then, even at the highest rungs of medieval society, you didn't escape the work. Sure, you weren't hauling water, but you were managing an entire estate. You had to supervise dozens of servants, keep account of supplies, ensure meals were coordinated, and maintain proper religious observance for everyone under your roof. You had to know how to pickle vegetables, stretch a winter pantry, mend fine linen, and write letters in perfect script, all while maintaining a figure that could fit into 15 layers of tightly laced silk. And let's talk about the clothes. Corsets that crushed your ribs, sleeves the length of your insecurities, headpieces so wide they couldn't fit through doorways without a slight tilt and prayer. These weren't fashion statements, they were declarations of status and suffering. And in case you were wondering, yes, noblewomen still bled. Still gave birth. Still faced judgment for having too few sons, or too many daughters, or for failing to look radiant 6 days after pushing out an heir. And their husbands? Often absent, at war, or in bed with someone else entirely. But fidelity was only expected on one side of the equation. Guess which? So no, she wasn't stomping grapes in Tuscany and sketching the sunset in her velvet robe. She was negotiating household labor, arranging dowries, and whispering prayers that her next pregnancy wouldn't kill her. And she did all of that while wearing shoes you couldn't run in, even if you wanted to. Now, let's talk about freedom, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Because if you were a woman in the Middle Ages, there was an actual list, not metaphorical, not emotional, but literal, of things you were not allowed to do. And let me assure you, it was far longer than your average medieval shopping list, which, by the way, mostly included onions, lard, and a vague hope for dried fish. For starters, you couldn't own property if you were married. Legally speaking, you were basically absorbed into your husband's identity the way butter disappears into hot porridge. You couldn't vote, not that anyone could really vote, but you especially could not. You couldn't testify in court unless it involved crimes like witchcraft, which, funnily enough, was also something you could be accused of for knowing too much about herbs or simply looking too confident on a Tuesday. You couldn't inherit wealth unless there were absolutely no men available, and even then, someone probably tried to marry you off immediately to get that land back under male control. You couldn't attend university. You couldn't become a priest. You couldn't read religious texts unless someone read them to you. And if you happened to be literate? That made people nervous. Reading? As a woman? What were you planning? Rebellion? Even clothing had rules. In some regions, a woman could be fined or punished for wearing colors or fabrics above her station. Velvet? Off limits. Fur trim? Don't even think about it. Sumptuary laws made sure everyone stayed in their place, and your place, if you were female, was under supervision. And of course, the church had plenty to say on the subject. Women were the weaker vessel, they said, more prone to sin, more likely to lead men astray. Eve was their cautionary tale, and modesty was their daily homework. A good woman was silent. A good woman was obedient. A good woman never, ever challenged authority. So imagine living like that. Imagine being told from birth that your curiosity was dangerous, your knowledge was suspicious, and your body was a vessel for sin. Imagine trying to raise children under that weight while simultaneously being expected to bless your husband's meals, thank the local priest for his sermons on female virtue, and keep your elbows covered at all times. It wasn't just that they weren't allowed to do certain things. It's that they were trained to believe they shouldn't even want to. Still, if you think they just sat there and took it, you're underestimating the power of boredom combined with intellect. Because medieval women may have been oppressed, but they were not stupid. They adapted. They watched. They whispered. You see, what they lacked in freedom, they made up for in strategy. In the fields, peasant women traded remedies with each other. The kind of herbal knowledge passed down through generations and entirely absent from any book a man had written. They knew how to soothe a colicky baby with chamomile, how to numb a toothache with clove, and how to stretch 2 onions and a turnip into a halfway edible stew for 6 people and a chicken. They were the unacknowledged physicians, midwives, counselors, and crisis managers of their communities, without titles, pay, or credit. They made candles out of animal fat, soap out of ashes, and fermented cabbage until it didn't kill you. And if you've never tried to make soap from scratch, allow me to save you the trouble. It's complicated, dangerous, and smells like regret. And they did it while pregnant. In winter. With 3 toddlers arguing over a splintered bowl. In noble households, cleverness took quieter forms. Women stitched coded messages into embroidery, taught their daughters to read behind closed doors, and managed entire estates while their husbands were off jousting or committing light treason. They organized the kitchens, the ledgers, the servant schedules, the feast days, the hunting dogs, all while appearing calm, ladylike, and not at all irritated by the fact that the lord of the manor had never once done the dishes. And let's not forget matchmaking. If you think modern dating is strategic, you've never watched 2 noble women conspire over dowries and bloodlines like they were playing 3-dimensional chess with lace gloves on. Every glance, every note, every gesture meant something. Love was optional. Advantage was everything. So yes, they couldn't speak publicly, or own much, or vote, or travel alone. But don't think for a second they weren't running things anyway. But for every whisper and clever workaround, there was always a risk, because stepping even slightly out of line could cost you everything. Speak too freely? You might be labeled unruly. Know too much about healing? You could be accused of witchcraft. Refuse your husband? That could land you in court, or worse, a cellar with chains. Women were punished not just for actions, but for perceptions. Was she too confident? Too outspoken? Did she read too often? Did she not cry enough at her husband's funeral? Congratulations, she might be a sorceress. And once suspicion began, it spread like fire in a dry thatch roof. Trials for witchcraft, while not as common in early medieval England as they would become later, did happen, and the accusations were often laughable if they weren't so horrifying. A woman might be blamed for a cow dying, a storm arriving, or a neighbor's bread failing to rise. The punishment? Public shame at best. Torture, imprisonment, or execution at worst. But even short of witchcraft, there were daily humiliations. Gossip, exile, isolation. A woman who didn't conform was simply removed. Silently. Permanently. So women learned to survive by shrinking themselves. They learned how to speak without speaking. How to disagree with a well-timed silence. How to teach their daughters what not to say out loud. How to blend in just enough to avoid notice, while never, ever forgetting what they knew. It wasn't cowardice. It was self-preservation. And they did it every day. For lifetimes. And yet, somehow, through all the rules, the labor, the judgment, and the endless silence, they still sang. Not loudly. Not boldly. But in lullabies by the hearth, in harvest songs with their sisters, in the quiet hums while darning socks with thread they spun themselves. Their voices carried stories that no scribe bothered to write down. Their hands passed down recipes, rituals, bits of knowledge too soft for parchment but too powerful to be forgotten. A mother rocking her child sang the same tune her grandmother did. A girl learning to spin whispered the same complaint about sore fingers. A noblewoman, staring out the window between prayers, thought the same thoughts as the milkmaid in the village, just with warmer feet. They couldn't leave diaries. They couldn't publish books. But they remembered each other. And they passed that memory along, in rhythm, in song, in the way they folded the laundry. And tonight, you remember them too. Let's talk about time, or rather, how in medieval life, everything took forever. There were no shortcuts. No dishwashers. No kettles that boiled in 90 seconds. No Google to tell you how long to bake something, and no timer to beep when it was done. If something needed to be done, you did it the long way. The exhausting way. The only way. And guess who did most of it? That's right, the women. Let's start with water. You wanted hot water? Great. First, grab your wooden bucket. Walk half a mile to the nearest stream. Fill said bucket, which now weighs about 40 pounds. Lug it home. Start a fire using damp kindling you collected before sunrise. Keep that fire going with a foot bellows while smoke burns your eyes. Then, and only then, you can heat your water in a pot that takes 4 to 5 minutes to reach anything close to warm. By then, your child has already spilled the flour, your stew has boiled over, and your husband is asking what's for supper. Cooking? Oh, that's adorable. First, grind your grains by hand, using a stone mill that requires upper body strength and the patience of a saint. Then knead the dough until your arms feel like salted ham. Bake it in a wood-fired oven that might burn the bread on one side and leave the other half raw, and you still have to act like you're proud of it. Nothing came pre-cut, pre-washed, pre-packaged, or pre-anything. If you wanted soup, you started by digging up the root vegetables yourself and hoping they hadn't frozen solid. If you wanted to light your home at night, you dipped your own candles in tallow, over and over, until you had a thick enough wick to last a few hours. And if you wanted to keep your children from freezing to death in January, you spent weeks sewing, stuffing, and patching together enough layers to wrap them like turnips. And all of this, all of it, had to be done again tomorrow. Nothing was permanent. There was no storing things for later. Milk soured in a day. Meat went rancid. Clothing wore thin. Fires went out. Roofs leaked. Buckets split. And women were the ones tasked with noticing, fixing, redoing, and repeating every single step. Even keeping warm was a project. No central heating. Just a fireplace and the hope that the wind didn't blow through the cracks in the wall that night. Children were sent to bed wearing their clothes. Women slept in shifts to keep the fire going. Blankets were patched with leftover wool scraps, and if you got a new one, it was because someone spent 3 weeks making it. By hand, in silence, probably while breastfeeding. You didn't just run out to the store. You walked to the village, in snow, in rain, in mud that tried to swallow your shoes, to barter for flour or eggs, and then walked home again with a baby on your back and a chicken under your arm. And by the time you got there, the fire had gone out again. So yes, your electric kettle is a miracle. Your supermarket is a luxury. Your washing machine? A goddess. Because everything back then took forever. And the person who spent the most time doing it was almost always a woman. Let's drop the linen curtain for a moment and talk about the parts of medieval life no one puts in storybooks. The disgusting, the dangerous, and the absolutely necessary tasks that women had to deal with every single day. You think taking out the trash is gross? Try scraping the contents of a chamber pot into the pig trough before breakfast. Or worse, emptying the family's waste into a ditch and praying the wind doesn't change direction. Because yes, indoor plumbing didn't exist, and yes, people still had bodily functions. And guess who cleaned that up? Oh yes, women. Every morning began with waste, human, animal, emotional. Laundry meant scrubbing out stains you didn't dare identify. Cleaning meant shoveling out muck from stables and sometimes digging latrines by hand, because compost was a thing long before Pinterest made it look cute. And those wooden floors you imagine in cottagecore fantasies? Try dirt. Real dirt. Packed earth, scattered with straw, filled with insects and tracked in pig slop. Speaking of insects, let's talk lice. Everyone had them. Noble, peasant, baby, priest, lice did not discriminate. Women spent hours picking them out of children's scalps, brushing them into bowls of vinegar, or burning them with hot combs. Fleas lived in beds. Mites lived in blankets. Ticks lived in dogs. It was like a petting zoo of parasites, and you were the main attraction. And food? Oh, you wanted to eat? You had to butcher something first. That meant taking a cleaver to a squealing pig or plucking the feathers off a half-dead goose while trying not to vomit. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or pickled to last, and even then, it could still go bad. Women had to sniff, scrape, rinse, and hope, and then serve it with a straight face. There were no expiration dates. Just your nose. If it didn't make you gag, it was probably fine. And then there were injuries. You burned yourself on the hearth. You cut your hand while splitting vegetables with a dull knife. You got blisters from spinning wool, or cracked fingernails from hauling wet laundry. And guess what? No band-aids. No Neosporin. Just some moldy bread, a prayer, and the faint hope that you wouldn't lose the limb. Childbirth wasn't even the worst thing that could happen to your body. At least then, someone was watching you. The rest of the time, you were alone, dealing with blood, bruises, burns, and bugs while still keeping dinner from burning. There were no days off. No protective gloves. No hand sanitizer. No masks. No feminine wipes. No wet ones. Just your dress, the same one you wore all week, and a rag stuffed into your waistband. And they did it all without complaint. Or rather, they probably complained constantly, but no one listened. So they kept going. Through the filth. Through the fear. Because someone had to. And that someone was almost always, ha. Now, let's take a brief detour into beauty. Or, more accurately, what passed for beauty when your mirror was a tarnished shard of polished tin and your makeup options included ashes, lard, and mercury. Being a woman in the Middle Ages didn't just mean working until your spine creaked. It also meant somehow managing to look modest but lovely, obedient but radiant, and pious but glowingly fertile while operating on 3 hours of sleep and a diet of porridge and turnips. Let's begin with hygiene, or the lack thereof. Bathing was rare. Not just because it was cold and inconvenient, but because it was actually thought to be dangerous. Medical experts at the time, and I use the term experts loosely, believed that hot water opened the pores and allowed disease to sneak into your body. So most women bathed maybe once a month, in a tub they shared with the rest of the family, starting with the father, then the sons, then the mother, and finally the daughters, by which point the water was more soup than soap. Hair was washed with water and vinegar, or sometimes with herbs like rosemary. Lice were combed out with fine-toothed wooden tools. If you were noble, you might have a maid do this for you, which sounds luxurious until you realize she was probably using the same comb on everyone. Makeup? You want a rosy glow? That'll be some crushed beetroot and maybe a smear of animal fat. Want fair skin? Congratulations, lead-based powder is your new best friend. Yes, lead. As in toxic. As in you might go blind before your wedding day but you'll look ethereal doing it. And let's not forget about fashion. The goal for women, peasant and noble alike, was to be covered, from chin to wrist to ankle. A flash of ankle could start rumors. A neckline too low might get you publicly shamed. But you still had to look put together. That meant underdresses, outer dresses, aprons, head coverings, wool stockings, shoes with wooden soles, all lead, all hand-sewn, all uncomfortable. And if you were a noblewoman? Heaven help you. Your sleeves alone could be 6 feet long. Your corset was tight enough to change your bone structure. Your hair had to be braided, oiled, coiled, and stuffed under a headdress that looked like a medieval satellite dish. You couldn't sweat. You couldn't slouch. You couldn't look too tired, even if you'd been up all night praying, nursing, or pretending your arranged marriage wasn't a waking nightmare. But the worst part? Even after all that, your worth was still determined by someone else's opinion. Because beauty wasn't for you. It was for your husband. For your family. For your future dowry. You weren't enhancing yourself, you were advertising. And in that world, the price of being pretty enough was often your health, your comfort, and your voice. Excellent call. Let's elevate segment 10 with a richly detailed scene of a noblewoman's morning routine, with full sensory description and the same tone you love, exhausted glamour, quiet suffering, and a healthy dose of modern comparison. So let's follow her, our noblewoman, as she wakes up, not to an alarm, but to the scraping of a wooden door and the soft, obedient murmurs of 2 young maids who have already been awake for over an hour, prepping her wash basin and warming the hearth. The room is cold. Always cold. The fire died hours ago, and her stone chamber holds onto the chill like a grudge. She rises slowly, her bones stiff despite her soft feather bed, because soft or not, no bed cures exhaustion when you're expected to look regal before breakfast. The maidservants begin their work. One helps her out of her nightgown, linen, simple, but hand-stitched and embroidered with her family crest. It's quickly whisked away to be laundered by someone else who will scrub it with lye and hot rocks and probably cry quietly into a bucket before noon. The other brings a basin, lukewarm water, because hot is too much trouble unless someone remembered to heat it in time. She dabs at her face, eyes half closed, trying not to shiver as she rubs a damp cloth across her cheeks. No soap, not really. Just a paste made of chalk, maybe a dash of vinegar if she's lucky. Hair comes next, long, heavy, and perpetually in the way. The maids unbraid it, comb it carefully, picking out knots and the occasional flea. She doesn't flinch anymore. You learn not to. The comb is bone, or wood, or metal if you're rich. The scent of rosemary or lavender hangs faintly in the air, a luxury that must be earned, grown, dried, and steeped over time. Her scalp stings from the tugging, but she says nothing. She is not here to complain. She is here to be beautiful. A touch of rouge is dabbed onto her cheeks, made from crushed berries or sometimes ochre mixed with grease. Her lips are stained with elderberry, and a faint dusting of powdered eggshell or white lead might be patted onto her neck and face to achieve the milky complexion considered fashionable, especially if you're trying not to look like someone who spends her afternoons sweating over an accounts ledger. Now comes the clothing, the corset first, of course. A stiff, unforgiving device designed not to flatter, but to contain. Her maids tighten it with brisk, practiced tugs. She exhales sharply as her waist is cinched to dimensions she hasn't actually had since the age of 11. Then layers, a chemise, a kirtle, perhaps a fardingale, then the overgown, richly embroidered, lined with fur or trimmed with braid. The whole ensemble weighs more than a modern backpack, and that's without the headdress. Which, by the way, must match the season, the occasion, and her mood, but not be too showy. A veil, a wimple, a henning, whatever makes her look elegant, modest, and expensive without inviting gossip. She cannot dress herself. She never has. Every button, every lace, every knot must be placed by someone else. Her arms are barely mobile by the time she's done. And when she finally descends to breakfast, which she may or may not be allowed to eat depending on the fasting calendar, she does so with a straight back, a blank face, and a silent prayer that no one notices the spot she didn't quite manage to scrub behind her ear. This is not glamour. This is maintenance. Daily. Relentless. Silent. Because to be born a noblewoman meant your beauty was public property. And to fail at it, even slightly, was to risk your worth in the eyes of your family, your husband, your servants, and God. So she smiles. And walks in shoes that hurt. And doesn't dare slouch. Because it's the Middle Ages. And she's expected to look like grace itself. While being stitched together with wool, lard, and fear. Let's now turn to a subject that defined medieval womanhood more than anything else: motherhood. And no, it wasn't cute. There were no diaper bags, no strollers, no Montessori flashcards. No baby-led weaning, no night nurses, no pastel Instagram nurseries with linen mobiles and soft light. Just babies. Endless, squirming, crying, leaking, utterly dependent babies. And toddlers. And sickly 6-year-olds. And wide-eyed 10-year-olds who were already being taught to plow fields or recite Latin, depending on how rich you were. Let's start with the peasant mother, because she didn't get a maternity leave. She didn't even get a maternity moment. She gave birth in a pile of straw or over a wooden stool, wiped her forehead, wrapped the baby in cloth she probably made herself, and was back up stirring pottage with a wooden spoon before the bleeding had stopped. Her day began with the first squawk of a hungry infant and didn't end until the fire had gone out and the goats had finally stopped trying to chew on her hem. She didn't watch the kids. She worked, and they were just there, clinging to her skirts, gnawing on carrots, throwing rocks at chickens, or getting dangerously close to the fire. And if they cried? She hushed them. If they misbehaved? She swatted them with a spoon and kept stirring. No lectures. No timeouts. No Pinterest-inspired reward charts. She had more important things to do, like keep all of them alive with no medicine, no vaccines, and no idea what that rash on their back was. And she wasn't raising 1 or 2 children. She was raising 8. Maybe 10. Possibly 13, because contraception was a whispered rumor and infant mortality was a brutal statistic. Half her children might not survive to adulthood. And still, she kept having them, because family survival depended on labor, and labor meant more hands. Now let's visit the noblewoman. You might think she had it easier, and in some ways, she did. She didn't nurse her own babies, that was the job of a wet nurse. She didn't rock them to sleep, that was a servant's job, too. But let's not romanticize it. Because if that child died, and many of them did, it was still her fault. Her womb was judged. Her bloodline questioned. Her status threatened. She was expected to produce heirs, not just babies. And if she didn't? She was pitted. Or blamed. Or quietly replaced. And even if she bore sons, strong, healthy, blonde little boys with noble jaws, she wasn't exactly allowed to raise them. That task went to tutors, priests, and political handlers. She got to look at them from a distance, kiss their foreheads when they didn't squirm, and try to pretend she wasn't being graded on their behavior like a living report card. Daughters? Slightly different. She might oversee their education in embroidery, prayer, and posture. But once puberty hit, the conversations turned to dowries and alliances, not self-esteem or dreams. And through all of this, both the peasant and the noble, there was no talk of mental load, emotional bandwidth, or parental burnout. There was just life. And all the children. All the time. And what did they feel? They probably felt tired. So tired, they couldn't articulate it. They felt proud. And overwhelmed. And numb. They laughed sometimes, when a child said something ridiculous or a baby grabbed their nose with surprising strength. But they also cried. Often alone. Often quietly. Because they were never just mothers. They were also cooks, cleaners, laundresses, midwives, gardeners, negotiators, seamstresses, caretakers for the elderly, defenders of the fire, and silent note-takers of every illness, injury, and emotional outburst. They didn't read parenting books. They didn't talk about gentle discipline. They raised children in between every other task, while bleeding, while aching, while praying they wouldn't lose another one this winter. And somehow, they did it again the next day. So here we are, centuries later, lying in our beds with our pillows, our playlists, and our temperature-regulated blankets, and still, we carry a thread of their quiet, relentless endurance. They didn't have time for therapy or podcasts or me time. But somehow, they made time to survive. To raise children. To hold communities together. To remember who they were, even if no one else did. And in the gentlest moments of night, when all the laundry's done, and the house is finally still, you might just hear their voices, tucked in the folds of silence. They never got to rest. So now, you must.